What if the numbers we use every day, the statistics that feel so neutral, weren't actually born from some simple quest for truth?
Hmm.
What if they were designed, maybe even intentionally, as tools for social control?
Right?
And what if that hidden history is like deeply woven into how we understand, diagnose, and even support conditions like autism right now?
That's a connection that I think surprises a lot of people.
Mm.
Statistics, psychiatric diagnosis,
Mm-hmm.
that seems so objective, right? Purely scientific fields.
Exactly.
But the source material we're digging into today, it's a piece by Jaime Hoerricks called Quantified and Contained:
Mm.
Autism, the DSM, and the Eugenic Roots of Statistical Authority.
Yeah.
It argues pretty compellingly, actually, that these fields share a common and, frankly, deeply troubling origin story.
Absolutely. And that's really our mission here, isn't it? To unpack the insights from this source. It asks us, to look beneath the surface of the systems we have now to see how these historical ideas about measuring and sorting people based on perceived worth, how they fundamentally shape the world autistic people navigate today.
Yeah, it's about understanding that often invisible architecture, the structure behind systems that have, really concrete, real-world consequences for people's lives.
The source's core argument is pretty stark, as you said. It suggests many of the tools we think of as just, objective measurement.
Were actually built intentionally to serve ideologies of power, control, and, exclusion.
Okay, let's unpack this then. What if the very numbers, the statistics we use to understand human difference, weren't created to help us understand it all, but were fundamentally designed, from the start, to contain and control?
That's precisely where the source kicks off. It argues that modern statistics, especially back in the early 1900s, wasn't just some abstract math thing.
Right.
It was developed specifically, the source claims, to legitimize the eugenics movement.
Yeah.
A deliberate effort to quantify human value along lines that were, inherently racialized, classed, and ableist.
And the source really puts names to this, doesn't it? It highlights key figures, the founders of modern statistics, and draws these direct, explicit lines to eugenics.
It really does. So Francis Galton is central here. He's famous for coining the term eugenics, right? And introducing concepts like correlation, regression to the mean.
Standard statistical concepts.
Totally. But the source emphasizes he didn't develop these just to neutrally study variation.
Yeah.
No. He did it to provide what he called scientific authority for these deeply prejudiced ideas about biological inferiority across race, class, disability lines.
Wow.
His statistical tools, according to this source, were designed explicitly.
So the source is saying these foundational statistical concepts weren't neutral at all from the start. They were literally crafted as instruments of control, not just analysis.
That's the core point it makes about their origin. And Galton's protege, Carl Pearson, he took these ideas and really embedded them institutionally.
How so?
Well, he founded the world's first university statistics department. And the source argues he placed eugenics right at the core of academic data science. Pearson explicitly believed, it says, that statistical knowledge should serve the state to manage the population.
Manage in what way?
Arguing that poor, disabled, and racialized people should reproduce less. Statistics, under his influence, became this mechanism of surveillance, essentially transforming social prejudices into what was presented as objective scientific fact.
And the source mentions a third key figure, Ronald Fisher, often seen as like a giant of 20th century statistics.
Right, Fisher. Huge contributions, ANOVA, significance testing, things many researchers use daily. But the source points out he also continued and defended this legacy. He actively supported eugenics, forced sterilization.
He argued for it.
Yeah, arguing that Britain's declining birth rate, for instance, was because the lower classes and the genetically unfit, as he termed them, were having too many children. So for Fisher, the source says, data was fundamentally a tool to protect existing racial and class hierarchies, all under this banner of scientific rationality.
So the source is making a really powerful claim here. The entire conceptual, academic, institutional infrastructure, the very methods we still use to collect and analyze data about people today, was shaped by these figures and their eugenic goals.
Exactly. That these methods weren't developed for justice or equity or care. The source says they were developed to exclude, to rank, and to decide who got to live freely and who did not.
That's quite a foundation.
It is. And understanding the historical foundation, source argues, is incredibly relevant to you today. Because these tools, this way of thinking about data and populations, they're still deeply embedded in the systems affecting lives now, especially diagnostic systems, support systems.
Which brings us right to the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, often seen as the gold standard, right?
The Bible of psychiatry, some call it.
But the source doesn't just see it as a neutral clinical reference book, it frames it as a social artifact.
Yes, one deeply rooted in that same eugenic logic of defining and containing difference. It argues the DSM is structured around these normative ideals, how useful, how productive, how conforming someone is expected to be.
And developed through a particular lens.
A lens that, the source claims, historically privileged certain bodies and minds, specifically cisgender, white, middle-class boys, and pathologized deviations from that norm. And its criteria weren't just shaped by science, but also by economic and political pressures.
And the source actually traces autism's specific path through the different DSM editions, showing how this framing played out over time.
It does. In the earliest versions, DSM-I and DSM-2 back in the 50s and 60s, autism wasn't even its own category.
Really? So what were autistic kids diagnosed with?
Typically things like childhood schizophrenia or labeled psychotic. And the source directly links this to those early eugenic attitudes, seeing these children as inherently defective, maybe dangerous, destined for institutions.
The goal wasn't support them.
The goal, the source argues, was removal from public life, sanitizing the population, basically,
Yeah.
grounded in this belief that these children wouldn't be useful.
Then DSM-3 came along in 1980, and it introduced infantile autism as a distinct category. That sounds like progress.
The source describes it as a formal shift, yes, but it points out the criteria were still incredibly rigid and fundamentally deficit-oriented. Meaning they pathologized traits like communication differences, social withdrawal, repetitive behaviors, without really considering context or meaning for the individual, just listing deficit.
Okay.
And crucially, these criteria were normed almost exclusively on studies of cisgender white boys, which inherently marginalized, well, everyone else.
And the source connects us to ABA.
Yeah, it argues this timing coincided with the rise of applied behavior analysis, which it says is rooted in extinguishing those very traits to achieve a more normal presentation. So suppressing difference, not supporting flourishing. Autism framed as a problem to be solved.
Then DSM-IV in 1994 expanded the umbrella, right? Adding Asperger's syndrome and PDD-NOS.
It did, and that led to a huge jump in diagnoses. More people became technically eligible for some kind of recognition. But the source argues the underlying logic was still about correction.
How so?
It suggests this functioned as a new form of enclosure, maybe not physical institutions as much, but increasingly directing autistic children into highly controlled educational settings or intensive treatments like ABA, focused on behavioral conformity. So more visibility, yes, but also more medicalization, more commodification, often aimed at masking or erasing autistic traits.
And then DSM-5 in 2013 collapsed those subcategories, Asperger's, PDD-NOS, into the single label, autism spectrum disorder, ASD. What were the consequences of that, according to the source?
Significant ones. Many people who had qualified under DSM-IV, especially those with the Asperger or PDD-NOS labels, suddenly lost their diagnoses and access to services.
Because the thresholds changed.
Yes, the criteria became stricter, consolidated. It also really disrupted identity for people who had embraced the Asperger label. And while a spectrum model was maybe intended to be more inclusive, the source argues it still largely prioritized observable deficits over lived experience and kept relying heavily on behavioral checklists normed on that same narrow historical demographic.
The source seems particularly critical of the most recent revision, the DSM-5-TR from 2022.
It is. Its critique here is quite sharp. It suggests this revision was driven less by new clinical insights and more by, well, economic and political interests. It even mentions potential backdoor contracting arrangements influencing the changes.
How did the criteria change?
They were quietly tightened again. So within certain domains, you now have to meet all the listed criteria, whereas DSM-5 allowed for meeting, say, 2 or more.
And the impact of that?
The source argues this change primarily serves insurers. It makes it easier for them to deny coverage, limit their liability. It calls it weaponizing diagnostic precision against those seeking support.
And who does that hit hardest?
It disproportionately impacts multiply marginalized people, people who mask their traits really effectively, and anyone whose presentation isn't easily quantifiable or consistent day to day.
So pulling back, the source's overall view of the DSM's history with autism is pretty critical.
Yeah, it argues the DSM has functioned less as a neutral scientific description and more as a tool of containment. defining who counts, who gets support, pathologizing difference, reducing complex human lives to checklist normed on privileged groups.
And its revisions weren't neutral either.
No, consistently shaped, the source argues, by ideologies of utility, whiteness, ableism, and increasingly economic expediency, as the source puts it quite bluntly. Autistic people deserve better than a diagnostic framework built on our exclusion.
That historical thread leads us directly to today, then. How does this legacy, these statistical tools born from eugenics, the DSM's framing, how does it actually play out for autistic people right now?
Well, the source argues that diagnosis today still functions as a system of statistical enclosure, whether you get legitimacy, whether you access care, whether you qualify for support. It's often rationed based on meeting these narrow numerical thresholds.
Thresholds from screening tools.
Exactly. From standardized screening tools. The source specifically names things like the RAA-DESR, the AQ10, the CATQ tools many people seeking diagnosis encounter.
And you mentioned earlier the original statistical tools were normed narrowly. The source says these current diagnostic thresholds still come from research samples that
continue to overrepresent cisgender white and male populations. That's a direct quote.
So the result is predictable then?
Yeah. If your presentation doesn't perfectly match that expected statistical profile, maybe you're a woman or trans or a person of color, maybe you mask heavily, maybe you communicate differently, you are statistically more likely to fall short of the required score.
So diagnosis isn't about holistic understanding.
It frequently hinges, the source argues, on how well your questionnaire answers align with the statistical profile generated by past diagnoses, often from those narrow groups, rather than truly understanding your lived experience.
Which loops right back to Galton and Pearson, doesn't it? The source explicitly connects this back to the origins of statistics.
It does. Concepts like regression and correlation, developed back then to create hierarchies of fitness, are now deeply embedded in psychometrics, the science of measuring psychological traits with numbers.
So your diagnosis can literally depend on how well your answers correlate with these predefined patterns.
That's the source's powerful link. Your score on a questionnaire determines if you fit the statistical mold closely enough.
And what about scores that are close but don't quite make the cutoff?
Well, the source points out those are often labeled subclinical, which, it argues, conveniently removes the obligation for systems to provide support while still kind of flagging you as deviant.
It's like not autistic enough for help, but still different enough to be noted.
Precisely. That's the dynamic the source describes.
And this statistical logic, it doesn't just stop at diagnosis, right? It influences interventions, too. The source talks about functional behavioral assessments, FBAs.
Right. FBAs often use statistically based methods like frequency charts, ABC charts, analyzing data patterns to figure out the supposed function or cause of a behavior.
What's the source's critique there?
That this approach often prioritizes surface patterns, the quantifiable data, over the actual context or the person's internal experience. It can easily treat correlation, two things happening together, as causation.
And bias can creep in.
Easily. Bias in what behaviors get counted as challenging in the first place. Bias in interpreting the data. The child's own perspective, their internal state, often gets ignored, and meaning is imposed through these statistical proxies and, frankly, normative expectations about how kids should behave.
And then there's ABA, Applied Behavior Analysis, which often highlights its evidence base and data collection.
The source acknowledges ABA collects data, often rigorously. But its critique is about what is being measured. It argues ABA primarily measures compliance, not necessarily genuine growth, connection, or autonomy from the individual's point of view.
So progress is defined differently.
Progress is often defined as reducing or extinguishing problem behaviors, tracked meticulously on charts. And the stated goal of many ABA programs, historically at least, has been to make the autistic person indistinguishable from their peers.
The source raises concerns about consent, too.
Yeah, it points out that meaningful consent from the individual, especially children, is often questionable or absent. And distress is frequently reframed within the ABA model as just non-compliance that needs to be worked through or overcome.
So even success might look different from the inside.
The source argues that even when a behavior disappears, which looks like success on the chart, it might actually mean the child has simply shut down, learned to mask more effectively, or withdrawn internally. A coping mechanism, not necessarily thriving.
The source's summary of this current situation feels quite pointed. Data isn't ultimately used to understand the person, it's used to justify controlling them.
The more quantifiable we are, the source writes, the more governable we become. That's a key line. Diagnosis, eligibility for services, school plans. It all hinges, the source argues, on these numerical thresholds and statistical norms that were never designed with our liberation in mind.
Offering containment, maybe, but not necessarily tailored to the individual.
That's the core argument. And this leads the source to look at the major players, the specific historical figures who shaped how autism itself was classified, not just the statistical tools used to measure it.
Right, and it contrasts the Western approach with the Soviet system.
Yeah, it makes this interesting point. Says, while the West often condemned Soviet psychiatry for being used for political control, our own system also controlled behavior, just maybe masked more effectively by academic credentials and data, rather than overt political dogma.
And it names specific individuals it sees as influential in constructing how we view autism. Leo Kanner, for instance, often credited with the first description.
The source's take is that Kanner didn't just discover autism, he constructed a problem. It argues he pathologized traits that could be seen differently, like intense sensory experiences, deep focus, different ways of relating, casting them narrowly as signs of emotional deficiency, portraying autistic children as isolated, withdrawn, inaccessible.
So his legacy, according to the source,
was one of classification and management, rather than empathetic understanding. Formalizing autism as something needing management, separation, pressure towards productivity, or rendering people invisible if they couldn't meet those demands.
Then there's Hans Asperger, whose name was tied to a diagnosis for so long.
The source places Asperger firmly in the context of Nazi-era Vienna. It describes him as being complicit in a eugenic system that sorted children based on their perceived utility to the state.
Sorting them how?
Those seen as potentially useful, often intellectually capable boys, were sometimes protected by him. But others, especially those with higher support needs or seen as having intellectual disabilities, were sent to horrific clinics like Spiegelgrund,
where they faced
experimentation, neglect, even murder. The source argues Asperger's clinical gaze was part of determining a child's value in that system. And it highlights that he likely ignored or dismissed earlier work by Grunya Sukareva.
Who was she?
A Soviet psychiatrist who described a very similar profile years before Kanner and Asperger. But her work, the source suggests, was more nuanced, more compassionate.
How so?
It recognized sensory and motor differences alongside emotional complexity, focused on understanding adaptive potential rather than just deficits or moral judgment. And importantly, her published work included girls, unlike Asperger's early work. The source presents her work as this kind of path not taken.
A more humanistic path.
Potentially, yes. More empathetic, less focused on fixing perceived deficits.
And the third figure the source focuses on is Ivar Lovaas, foundational in ABA in the U.S.
Right. And the source points out Lovaas was quite explicit. He described autistic children as not people in the psychological sense early on. His stated goal was to build a person using systematic reinforcement and punishment.
Including controversial methods.
Including the early, highly controversial use of electric shocks as aversives. His methods aim to make autistic children indistinguishable from their peers. The source also connects him to the UCLA Feminine Boy Project.
What was that?
A project that used similar behavioral techniques, trying to correct gender nonconformity in young boys. The source sees a consistent underlying logic. Deviation from the norm is something to be eradicated.
So the source argues these figures weren't isolated, but part of a larger system.
Part of what it calls a psychiatric industrial complex, seeking to reshape human behavior to fit normative standards.
With the DSM providing the categories.
And statistics providing the veneer of scientific authority. Screening tools, data-driven interventions, behavior charts. The source says all these tools functioned in this historical context to turn difference into deviance, and deviance into something treatable, or, if resistant, disposable.
Compliance enforced through numbers.
Exactly. Not just authority, but metrics like standard deviations, significance levels. The source concludes this section by saying we're still living inside the consequences of choosing the path laid by Kanner, Asperger, and Lovaas, instead of the one hinted at by Sukareva.
That history definitely sounds like it would create what the source calls an active infrastructure of misunderstanding today. Like, the echoes are still loud.
It argues they are. The systems we have for diagnosis, education, funding, support, they're still fundamentally shaped by these historical tools and this deficit-focused way of thinking. They operate using the language of thresholds, burdens, quantifiable behaviors.
And the result.
Often, autistic people being misrecognized, mistreated, or missed altogether.
What are some specific current challenges the source highlights that stem directly from this legacy?
Well, diagnostic ambiguity is a huge one. The DSM criteria remain quite narrow, quite rigid, and critically still largely normed on that historical template. Cis, white, male children.
Which systematically excludes.
People whose presentation doesn't fit that mold. Maskers, people who communicate differently, girls, women, gender-diverse people. They're routinely misdiagnosed with other things, or just left undiagnosed entirely.
The source mentions telehealth.
Yeah, it suggests the rise in telehealth evaluations can actually make this worse sometimes. This sort of flattened interaction can reward surface performance, making it harder to see beneath a mask. And the very sensory regulation strategies someone might use can be misinterpreted as neurotypical. Maskers often get penalized by their own successful adaptation.
And it sounds like clinicians themselves might be constrained by their training.
That's another major point. The source argues many clinicians are trained to rely heavily on those standardized screening tools, the scores, the cutoffs, but get insufficient training in recognizing the full, diverse range of autistic experience.
So diagnosis becomes like math.
It can become arithmetic, not understanding, as the source puts it, reducing a person's complex humanity to a checklist score. Often there isn't the time, or maybe the framework, to consider context, personal history, trauma, the meaning behind behaviors.
And if it's not easily quantifiable.
It often gets filtered out.
Yeah.
And people who don't neatly fit the statistical template get told they don't qualify, even when they're drowning. That's a direct quote.
And these diagnostic decisions aren't just academic. They have huge real-world consequences. They're gatekeepers.
Absolutely crucial.
Yeah.
Schools, insurance companies, government support systems, they often treat the DSM criteria and those diagnostic scores as absolute gospel, without considering the limitations and biases the source highlights.
So support gets denied.
Support gets denied because scores are too low. Therapy gets cut off because someone's deemed too high functioning based on a checklist. Students get pushed out of schools because their needs don't fit the bureaucratic boxes rooted in this narrow framing. The source argues these systems are almost designed to filter out complexity.
And finally, the source points to how statistics themselves continue to drive stigma in the public conversation about autism.
Right. Think about the headlines. Dominated by numbers. 1 in 36. Statistics about higher risk for this or that, framing autism as a healthcare burden.
Language focused on cost and prevalence.
Exactly. And the source argues this language rarely includes the necessary context about systemic violence, about ableism, about the unmet needs that contribute to poor outcomes. Autism gets presented as a problem, a threat, a costly deviation. Autistic people, it argues, are rendered legible only when we become legible as risk.
That really brings the history into the present, makes it feel very immediate for the listener. The source concludes this section powerfully. What we inherit is a map of care designed to keep us out.
It is calibrated not to see autistic life in all its richness, but to categorize it, limit it, and where possible, erase it. We are measured constantly and yet rarely understood.
That's a heavy conclusion.
It is, but the source doesn't just leave us there in the critique. It also describes this powerful countercurrent,
Okay.
one rooted in the lived experience of autistic people themselves, what it calls narrative sovereignty.
Narrative sovereignty. So taking control of the story.
Exactly. It's about autistic people defining themselves, writing their own theories, organizing, creating culture, remembering themselves into visibility, actively refusing to just be passive research subjects while others study and profit from them.
And the source links this to the neurodiversity paradigm.
Directly. It emphasizes that neurodiversity was driven by autistic people, and it fundamentally rejects that old deficit model. It frames autistic traits not as disorders to be fixed, but as natural variations in human neurology. Variations needing understanding, accommodation, support, not correction or eradication.
And autistic-led scholarship has played a role.
A huge role, the source argues, exposing harms of practices like certain forms of ABA, critically questioning the diagnostic frameworks we've discussed, demanding systemic overhaul based on human rights and dignity. The source says this work isn't just critiquing, it's actively reconstructing.
However, the source also offers a warning, right, about the system co-opting the language.
Yeah, a cautionary note about what it calls the diagnostic industrial complex, perhaps using the language of inclusion or neurodiversity while actually doubling down on control mechanisms.
Each is an example.
It points to funding patterns, like from the Autism Cares Act in the U.S., arguing that huge sums still disproportionately flow into biomedical and genetic research, surveillance tech, and ABA things, the source frames as tools of containment.
How does data play into that?
Large-scale data collection efforts often frame autistic people as public health risks or financial burdens. These numbers are then used to justify funding for early intervention or cost-reducing therapies that often prioritize conformity.
While autistic-led initiative.
Remain grossly underfunded, according to the source. It argues there's a vast autism research economy that thrives on seeing autistic people as problems to be managed rather than as thinkers and experts in their own right.
But the source really pushes back against that framing, insisting autistic people are experts.
Yes, analysts of our own experience. Actively reframing autism not as a disorder, but as a complex way of being with its own logic, its own sense of time, its own ways of relating. Building new frameworks based on lived experience.
Like ecological validity?
Things like ecological validity, understanding behavior in its actual context and relational ethics, centering connection and consent, and crucially, asking fundamentally different questions.
Instead of, how do we fix this?
Right. Asking things like, what environmental conditions and supports actually help autistic people thrive? Not just survive, but thrive. Or what unmet needs or systemic violences might those challenging behaviors be responding to? Shifting the focus from the individual deficit to the environment and the relationship.
So reclaiming this narrative sovereignty, it's about centering autistic interpretations.
Centering autistic interpretations, clearly naming systemic violence and ableism where they exist, and building knowledge through dialogue and mutual understanding, not just by comparing people to a statistical norm. The source describes this act of self-definition as fundamentally political.
Why political?
Because if we define ourselves, the source writes, we can redefine the systems that surround us. If we tell the story differently, perhaps we can begin to live differently too.
That's a powerful idea. Which brings us to the final reflections offered by this source material. Where does it leave us?
Well, it leaves us with the thought that autism has always been political, that the very language we use, the clinical terms, the statistical measures, the diagnostic categories, was forged, according to this analysis, in a history of control. Psychiatry and statistics developed together, hand in hand, often in service of eugenics. And that legacy, it argues, persists. It's still here in our criteria, our tools, our assumptions.
But the source isn't saying we should throw out all measurement entirely, is it?
No, not at all.
Yeah.
It's not that measurement itself is inherently bad. The point is that their origins matter, that their uses must be interrogated, and that their authority is not immune to critique. That's key.
So data can be used differently.
Data can absolutely serve liberation, the source suggests, but only if it's actively reclaimed, repurposed, and made answerable to the communities it purports to represent. And diagnosis itself, it acknowledges, can be a necessary gateway to support.
If it's used differently.
If it's wielded with humility, context, and consent. And crucially, understood as just one small part of who a person is, not the whole story.
The core problem identified by the source seems to be
that we have allowed measurement to dictate meaning, to overwrite narrative, to stand in for care. That feels like the crux of it.
And it leaves us, the listeners, with some challenging questions to mull over, doesn't it?
Definitely. Provocative questions for building better systems. What might support actually look like if it didn't demand compliance with someone else's statistical bell curve?
Right.
What could we design if we started not from deficit, but from relationality? If we treated autistic people not as outliers needing correction, but as co-constructors of knowledge, culture, and kinship?
Those feel like incredibly urgent questions to be asking right now, because the source's conclusion is quite stark.
Yeah, it concludes, as long as care is conditioned on conformity and legitimacy on legibility, meaning being easily measured and understood within these potentially biased frameworks, autistic people will remain inside a quantified cage.
The quantified cage.
And its final, powerful call to action is simply, it's time to open the door.
A really vital reminder, I think, that understanding where our tools and categories come from, their history, their biases, is absolutely essential if we want to build a future that's genuinely just, supportive, and respects the full spectrum of human difference. That is definitely a lot to think about.